Then, you guys asked me a lot of great questions, and today I'm going to be trying to answer them as best I can. So, I'm going to start out with this first question, which actually several people in class asked about. And they said, what is it? Basically, the questions were similar. What is gravity? All right, so when we talk about gravity, what I should first discuss is the idea of a force. And if you remember from class, we learned that a force is either a push or a pull. Now, push or pull could be either a non touching force or a touching force. So here's some examples of touching forces. The people you see in the top are holding on to the rope, so they're pulling. That's a touching force. The person on the bottom is swinging a bat. The bat hit the ball, so that's also a touching force between the bat and the ball. The bat pushes the ball. Of course, there are some non touching forces. So, for example, gravity. When the apples fall, uh, nothing's touching it until at least until it hits the buckets. And that's because gravity is a non touching force, as is magnetism. You see, the two balls, which are magnetic, are not touching, but they do exert a force even when they're not touching. Basically, what gravity is, other than being a non touching force, you have gravity whenever you have something massive. And anything that has mass has a small amount of gravity. And the more mass it is, the more gravity it has. And the way scientists look at it now is that it's the idea that basically space is being curved the more massive an object is. So you see on the left is the an image of Earth bending space a little bit, and there's a decent amount of gravity because Earth is very big, but compared to the sun, which is much bigger, there's a lot less gravity. So you would actually, if you were able to stand on the sun, you would weigh a lot because the sun has a lot of mass, and there'd be a lot more gravity than there is here on Earth. So gravity is basically a non-touching force that pulls on objects. Okay, our next question, a student asks, what is Pluto like? And what's the weather like on Pluto? Are there humans who live there? All right, so first of all, we really didn't know much about Pluto until recently. In 2017, a few years ago, the New Horizons space probe flew very close by Pluto and took this and other pictures showing us a good view of Pluto. Up to then, it would just look kind of like a dot. What we do know about Pluto is that it's very, very cold. So it has a high temperature of minus 369 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about as warm as it gets. So not 369, minus 369. So imagine 0 degrees Fahrenheit outside. That's a really cold day. Anything below zero is really, really cold, and minus 369 degrees is absolutely unbelievably cold. But it gets colder than that. It gets down to about minus 387 degrees. And just to give you an idea of how cold that is, there's actually a point at which it can't get any colder. We call that absolute zero. And that's less than 100 degrees less than that. So that's minus 459 degrees. That's as cold as it can possibly get. That's when the stuff that things are made of are literally not moving, and that's what we mean by absolute zero. So that kind of answers the other question: are there humans living on Pluto? Uh, Very unlikely. Way too cold. Humans just wouldn't survive there, of course, right? So no, and also the sun just looks like a tiny dot, like a star. So it's freezing. It's dark there. Now, the interesting, what a lot of people wonder about Pluto, is it a planet? And recently, well, within the past, I don't know, 10 years or so, scientists no longer consider Pluto a planet. And nothing actually happened to Pluto. It's just that if we look at this video here, this animation, we see this one where it's kind of tilted. That's Pluto. So it's actually has kind of a strange orbit, and it's actually a lot smaller than most of the other planets. And scientists just decided that it made sense to classify Pluto as a dwarf planet instead of calling it a planet. But it really doesn't matter. It's a large object in the solar system. So some people still think it's a planet. All right, next question, a student asks, what is metal made of? And then I have a related question, what is used to make electricity? So I'll address the first one first. All right, so first of all, we have air, which is matter, a couch, which is matter, a person, it's also matter. So matter, the way we would define that is that is a matter is everything that takes up space, and that would be made of matter. So the air, everything around us, anything that you could touch, feel, even if you can't feel it like the or see it like air, it's still made of matter. And matter is made of something called atoms. So here's a diagram of an atom. That red circle in the middle is called the nucleus, and that blue thing on the outside is called, going around, is called an electron. So that's an atom. And sometimes atoms combine to make bigger particles, which are still very small, called molecules. And usually, for most matter, the electrons just orbit around either one atom or one molecule. They might share electrons. But for metals, the electrons tend to flow all around all the atoms that are connected. So if you have like a piece of metal, the electrons will be shared by all the metals. You can see those little red dots on the bottom moving everywhere. And basically, that's a property of metal. Another property is that they usually have a certain luster. They're shiny usually, but they look different. They're different colors. But generally, we could tell by looking at something because of its shine and its texture that it's a type of metal. Here are some examples: brass, aluminum. But the key idea is that, or the most interesting thing about a metal is that electrons can travel through them instead of just staying where they are. So with that in mind, that's going to help me answer the question about electricity. So there are two basic ways to make electricity. First of all, we could use a battery. And what a battery basically is, it has two types of chemicals in on one side, and then on the other side, it's a different chemical. And the electrons from one of the chemicals tend to be attracted more to the other chemical. And when you do that, you get a flow of electrons. And there's actually a name for that flow of electrons. We simply call it electricity. And when we have a flow of electrons, it makes electrical energy, and you could do things with that electricity, like use any appliance you use in everyday life. A hair dryer, a radio, computer, TV, whatever, a game system. Another way is to use a generator. We actually did this in class. We were able to generate a small amount of electricity, and that uses magnets and motion to make electrons flow. That's basically how the electricity we get in our homes, that's where that comes from. It comes from huge generators and that pump electricity all throughout cities and towns. And again, anything that runs on electricity you could use from generated electricity. So I hope that answers most of your questions. Thank you for your questions, Class 10.